No one in my family answers the phone after midnight. My sister found out why. There was a rule in my family, a rule etched into our souls since we could barely speak: never, ever answer the phone after midnight. The night my sister broke it, our entire life, everything we thought we knew, was ripped apart and set on fire. Growing up, this wasn't some quaint family quirk. This was law. Mom would check our phones every single night, making sure the ringers were off. Dad even installed special software that automatically silenced all calls between midnight and 6 o'clock in the morning. My older sister Ivy and I never questioned it, because questioning rules in the Graves household just wasn't an option. We accepted it, the same way we accepted that dinner was at 6 o'clock sharp and church was mandatory every Sunday. When I was 8, I finally dared to ask Mom why. She was folding laundry in the living room, and her hands literally froze mid-fold. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between raw fear and simmering anger. Her voice was low when she said the rule existed to protect us from dangerous people who operate in darkness. Nothing good, she insisted, ever came from phone calls after midnight. People who called then had bad intentions. I remember just nodding, never asking again. Her reaction scared me more than any explanation could have. Then, Ivy turned 22. I was 19, home from college for winter break. It was a Thursday night in December, and I'd fallen asleep watching Netflix around 11 o'clock. Suddenly, a sound jolted me awake, Ivy's voice, coming from her bedroom right next door. At first, I thought she was talking in her sleep, or maybe on some late-night video call she'd started before the deadline. But then I checked my phone. The screen blared back, 1:38 in the morning. My stomach dropped like a stone. A cold dread seeped into my bones. Ivy would never break that rule. Not unless something was profoundly, terribly wrong. I crept out of bed and pressed my ear against her door. Her voice sounded strange. Flat. Emotionless, almost like she was reading from a script. I couldn't make out the words, but the sheer tone of it made my skin crawl. I knocked softly, calling her name. Nothing. The monotone talking continued for another 5 minutes, then, dead silence. I tried the door handle. Locked. I knocked harder, calling her name louder this time, until Mom and Dad appeared in the hallway, their faces etched with panic. Dad had a master key for all the bedroom doors. He fumbled it into the lock, pushed open Ivy's door, and there she was, sitting on her bed in the dark, phone in her lap, staring blankly at the wall. The only light came from her phone screen, still active, showing a call that had been going for 1 hour and 17 minutes. Dad snatched the phone and hung up immediately. But Ivy didn't react. She just kept staring at that same spot on the wall, like she was in some kind of trance. Mom flicked on the lights and started shaking Ivy's shoulders, calling her name over and over. It took almost 10 agonizing minutes before Ivy blinked, her eyes finally seeming to recognize where she was. When she finally snapped out of it, the worst part was, she couldn't remember answering the phone. She said she'd been asleep, then woke up to us standing in her room. No memory of the call. No memory of what she'd said during those 77 minutes. Dad checked the call log, and his face went completely white. The incoming number, we all recognized it. It was taped inside every single cabinet in our kitchen. The number we were supposed to call if there was ever an emergency. The number that belonged to someone named Lawrence Kane. I'd seen that number my entire life, but never questioned who Lawrence was or why we needed to contact him. It was just another one of those unspoken family things. But seeing Dad's terror-stricken reaction to that number in Ivy's call log, something clicked in my mind. This wasn't about protecting us from random dangerous people. This was about protecting us from one specific person. And that person had just made contact with my sister in the middle of the night. Mom started crying, pleading with Ivy, "What did you tell him? What did you say?" Ivy just insisted she didn't remember talking to anyone. Dad was on his own phone within seconds, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. I heard words like activated, protocol 3, and possible contamination. I stood there, feeling like I'd woken up in a completely different family, a terrifying nightmare where nothing made sense anymore. Dad hung up. 45 minutes, he said, his voice clipped. Pack 1 bag each with essentials. We're leaving. And we won't be coming back for a while. The next hour was pure chaos. Mom was throwing clothes into suitcases while Dad was yanking dusty boxes out of the attic, boxes I'd never seen before, labeled emergency documents and relocation kit. I packed my bag in a daze, my mind racing, trying to process any of it. Ivy moved like a robot, following Mom's instructions without speaking, her eyes distant. As if part of her was still somewhere else. At exactly 3:27 in the morning, 2 black SUVs pulled into our driveway. 4 people got out, all in dark suits, looking like they'd stepped straight out of a government thriller movie. A woman named Victoria Brennan introduced herself as our family security coordinator. She spoke with military precision, immediately directing everyone. She separated Ivy from us, putting her in the second SUV with a man she called Dr. Sheffield. Victoria explained Ivy needed to be evaluated to determine what information she might have shared during the call. They drove away first, leaving us to follow in the other vehicle. I tried to ask the driver where we were going, but he just said, everything will be explained at the secure location. We ended up at a facility that looked like a medical building from the outside, but felt like a bunker once you were inside. Concrete walls. No windows. Every door required a key card. They put us in separate rooms for questioning. A man named Officer Dalton spent 3 hours grilling me about my family history, what I knew about Lawrence Kane, and if I'd noticed any unusual behavior from Ivy. I answered honestly, I knew almost nothing about any of this. When Dalton finally let me out, I found Mom and Dad in a conference room with Victoria and 2 other officials. Papers were spread across the table, Mom was signing documents while Dad just stared at his hands, defeated. Victoria saw me and gestured for me to sit. That's when she dropped the bombshell. Your family, she said, has been in witness protection for the past 23 years. Our real last name wasn't Graves. Mom and Dad had testified against Lawrence Kane in a racketeering case when I was just a baby. He'd been sentenced to life in prison, but he'd maintained his criminal organization from behind bars. The midnight phone rule, she explained, existed because Lawrence's organization had a specific protocol for contacting protected witnesses. They would call between midnight and 6 a.m., using numbers that looked legitimate, banks, hospitals. If someone answered, they'd use psychological manipulation to extract information about current locations, new identities, daily routines. These calls were terrifyingly dangerous, Victoria said, because the person being manipulated often had no memory of providing information. It was a form of conversational hypnosis Lawrence's people had perfected over decades. Ivy had broken the rule. She'd answered. And now, they needed to determine what she'd revealed. Dr. Sheffield was working with her, using something called forensic hypnosis to recover those memories. It could take days, even weeks. In the meantime, our entire family had to be relocated again. Our current identities were compromised. My entire world crumbled. Everything we'd built over the past 2 decades, our home, our jobs, our friends, all of it, had to be abandoned, immediately. Every memory I had, every friendship, every plan for my future, all of it was based on a lie. I wasn't who I thought I was. My parents weren't who I thought they were. And my sister had just destroyed the fragile safety we'd been living in, without even knowing it. Dad tried to explain that they'd planned to tell us at 25. They wanted to give us as much normal childhood as possible before burdening us with this brutal reality. Mom kept apologizing through tears, saying they thought they'd done everything right to keep us safe. 3 days later, Dr. Sheffield finished with Ivy. He called us into a different conference room and played an audio recording. It was Ivy's voice, flat and robotic, answering questions with chilling detail. She provided our home address, Dad's current employer, my college name and major, Mom's car make and model, and a detailed description of our daily routines. She'd essentially given Lawrence's organization everything they needed to find us, to monitor us. The person on the other end had asked specific questions, designed to extract maximum information in minimum time. Victoria explained that Lawrence's people now had a complete profile of our lives. They knew where we lived, worked, went to school, our patterns. The organization was probably already positioning people to watch us, waiting for the right moment to act. Lawrence's typical approach, she said, was to conduct surveillance for several weeks to confirm the information before making a move. That meant we had maybe 2 or 3 weeks maximum before things escalated from watching to action. We needed to disappear completely before that window closed. The U.S. Marshals took over our case that same day. Agent Ramsey became our primary handler, starting the process of creating new identities for all 4 of us. We spent a week in that bunker facility while they processed paperwork, created new documents, and arranged our relocation. During that week, I learned things about my parents I'd never known. Their real names were David and Ellen Pritchard. Before witness protection, Dad had been Lawrence's accountant, Mom his personal assistant. They'd turned against him when they discovered he was ordering hits on people who crossed him. Mom had witnessed Lawrence giving the order to kill a prosecutor and recorded the conversation. Dad provided financial records showing Lawrence's money laundering. Their testimony had been crucial, but it had also made them permanent targets. Lawrence had connections everywhere, in prison, in law enforcement, everywhere. That's why witness protection had been necessary, and why breaking the midnight phone rule had been so catastrophic. I asked Ramsey why Lawrence was so obsessed with finding us after all these years. It wasn't just revenge, he said, though that was part of it. Lawrence's organization still operated, run by his son and lieutenants. Finding and eliminating witnesses from the original case sent a message to current and future informants. Lawrence's reach was eternal. It was about maintaining fear and control. Mom and Dad weren't the only former associates who testified. There had been 7 witnesses total, and 3 of them had died under mysterious circumstances in the past decade, despite being in witness protection. The realization that we'd been living with this terrifying threat hovering over us for my entire life made me feel sick. Every birthday party, every school play, every normal moment of my childhood had existed against a backdrop of danger I'd never known about. Dad tried to explain that they'd wanted to protect our innocence for as long as possible, that knowing about Lawrence would have stolen our ability to be kids. I understood their logic, but I couldn't shake the burning feeling of betrayal. They'd made the decision to keep us in the dark, and now Ivy and I were paying the price for their secrets. 2 weeks after the phone call, we were relocated again, to a city I can't name, in a state I can't mention. Our new identities were more carefully constructed this time. Ramsey said they'd learned from mistakes in the previous placement. Our new last name was Thornhill. Dad became Gordon. Mom became Susan. I became Alex. And Ivy became Nicole. We had completely fabricated histories, school records, employment records, even social media accounts backdated to look authentic. The marshals rented us a house in a quiet neighborhood and set us up with new phones that had monitoring software installed. Ivy struggled the most. She'd been in her final year of college when everything imploded. She had a serious boyfriend, close friends, a job lined up. All of it vanished overnight. She couldn't contact anyone, couldn't explain where she'd gone, couldn't even say goodbye. She sank into a depression that scared all of us. Dr. Sheffield recommended therapy, but finding a therapist who understood witness protection was complicated. The Marshal Service eventually connected her with Dr. Amanda Yates, who specialized in trauma and had security clearance to work with protected witnesses. I enrolled in a new college under my new name and tried to build a life that felt somewhat normal. But I couldn't make real friends because I couldn't tell them the truth about who I was. Every conversation felt like a performance where I had to remember my lines perfectly. One slip, one inconsistent detail, and the whole facade could crumble. I started keeping a notebook, writing down everything about my fake identity so I wouldn't forget important details. It felt insane to need a cheat sheet to remember my own supposed childhood, but that was the reality of living a manufactured life. Mom got a job as an administrative assistant at a medical office. Dad found work as a bookkeeper for a small construction company. They were both wildly overqualified for these positions, but they couldn't use their real credentials or work history. Starting over in your mid-40s with a completely blank resume was brutal. I watched them struggle with the loss of everything they'd worked for. Dad had been a successful accountant with his own clients. Mom had been on track for an executive position. Now, they were entry-level employees, barely making enough to pay bills. 6 months into our new lives, Ramsey showed up at our house with 2 other agents. They'd intercepted communications indicating that Lawrence's organization had tracked us to our general region. They didn't have our exact location yet, but they were narrowing the search. Ramsey recommended we relocate again, immediately. Dad exploded. He stood up, yelling, "We can't keep running forever. We've already lost everything once. I'm not doing it again." Mom tried to calm him, but he was beyond reasoning. Ramsey explained that the organization had sophisticated methods. Data brokers, hacked databases, informants in supposedly secure places. One slip on social media, he said, one security camera capture, one facial recognition match, and they'd have us. The threat was real, immediate. Dad demanded to know the alternative. Ramsey said there wasn't one. Relocate, or stay put with enhanced security measures. Dad chose to stay. The rest of us followed his decision, utterly exhausted from running. The enhanced security included cameras around our house, panic buttons in every room, and a direct line to local police who'd been briefed on our situation. Ramsey assigned an agent named Douglas Craig to conduct periodic drive-bys and check-ins. Craig would park on our street for hours, watching for any suspicious activity. I got used to seeing his gray sedan with the tinted windows, sitting 3 houses down. It became a strange kind of comfort, knowing he was there. Even though his presence was a constant, stark reminder of the danger we lived in. Ivy started making progress in therapy with Dr. Yates. She was learning to process the crushing guilt she felt about answering that phone call. Dr. Yates helped her understand she'd been targeted with sophisticated psychological manipulation and that blaming herself wasn't productive. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are 2 different things. Ivy carried the weight of what she'd done like physical chains. She barely ate, barely slept, and I'd often find her staring at nothing, tears silently streaming down her face. I tried to be supportive, but I was dealing with my own simmering anger. Part of me blamed Ivy for destroying our lives, even though I knew it wasn't rational. She hadn't intentionally answered the phone, she'd been asleep and somehow manipulated into picking up without being fully conscious. But logic didn't erase the fact that my entire existence had been upended because of her actions. I struggled with resenting her, while simultaneously feeling guilty for that resentment. Our relationship became strained and awkward. We barely spoke beyond necessary exchanges. 8 months after the relocation, Agent Craig spotted a man conducting surveillance on our house. The man was sitting in a coffee shop across the street with a laptop, but Craig noticed him taking photos of our home. Craig approached and questioned him. The man claimed to be a real estate photographer, with business cards and a legitimate-looking website. But Craig's instinct screamed something is off. He took the man's information, ran a background check that came back clean, but still reported the incident to Ramsey. Ramsey increased our security level, assigned a second agent for overnight surveillance, and recommended we vary our routines and be hypervigilant. The paranoia that had started to fade came rushing back with a vengeance. Every car that drove past our house too slowly became a potential threat. Every person who looked at us twice became suspicious. We were living in a constant state of anxiety that was slowly destroying us. Mom started having panic attacks. Dad developed insomnia. Ivy's depression worsened. And I felt myself becoming a hollow shell of who I used to be. 3 weeks after the surveillance incident, Ramsey came to our house with news that changed everything. They'd arrested someone connected to Lawrence's organization, a mid-level operator named Vincent Ortega, who'd been running the witness location program. During interrogation, Vincent revealed a shocking truth: Lawrence was dying. Terminal cancer. 6 months, maybe. Lawrence had made finding and eliminating Mom and Dad his final mission. He was pouring all remaining resources into locating us because he wanted revenge before he died. This information was both terrifying and, oddly, hopeful. If Lawrence died, his son might not maintain the same level of commitment to hunting us down. The organization would likely shift focus to protecting their current operations, rather than pursuing old vengeance. Ramsey said we just needed to survive long enough for Lawrence to die, and then our threat level would decrease significantly. It wasn't a guarantee of safety, but it was better odds than we'd had before. The question was, could we outlast him? Vincent also provided information about how the organization had been tracking us. They'd been monitoring database breaches, using stolen information to cross-reference potential identities. They'd found us through a combination of Mom's medical records from a specialist appointment and facial recognition software that flagged her at a grocery store. The technology available to criminal organizations, Ramsey explained, was becoming indistinguishable from what law enforcement had access to. This was a growing problem in witness protection. The old methods of simply changing names and moving to new cities weren't sufficient anymore. Based on Vincent's information, Ramsey recommended we make another move, but this time with different protocols. He wanted us to go to a smaller, more isolated location where surveillance would be easier and facial recognition less likely. He suggested a rural area, where we'd actually stand out less because everyone stood out. Small towns had their own security benefits, everyone noticed strangers, which made it harder for outside operatives to blend in. Mom and Dad agreed to the move, and within a week, we were packing up again. Our third identity became the Mercer family. We moved to a town of 8,000 people, in a state that felt like a different country from where we'd been. Everything was slower, quieter, more isolated. Dad got a job at a local feed store. Mom found work at the town library. Ivy and I both enrolled in online college programs so we wouldn't have to attend physical campuses where facial recognition could spot us. Our house was a small ranch at the end of a dirt road, the nearest neighbor half a mile away. It was lonely, even depressing, but it was also as safe as we could reasonably be. Agent Craig remained our primary security contact, now conducting check-ins remotely and making monthly visits in person. Ramsey called weekly with updates on Lawrence's condition. The cancer was progressing faster than doctors had predicted. Lawrence was now in hospice care and wasn't expected to last more than a few weeks. Each call from Ramsey brought news that Lawrence was weaker, more incapacitated, closer to the end. We lived in this strange limbo, waiting for a man we'd never met to die, so we could stop running from his shadow. Lawrence Kane died on a Monday morning in April. Ramsey called us with the news, and I could hear the sheer relief in his voice. He said the organization was already fragmenting without Lawrence's leadership. His son was facing a power struggle with the other lieutenants, and they were too busy fighting among themselves to worry about old witnesses. Ramsey said we should maintain our current identities and location for at least another year, just to be safe. But the immediate threat had significantly decreased. For the first time in over a year, I felt like I could truly breathe. Ivy's recovery accelerated after Lawrence's death. Knowing that the immediate danger had passed lifted some of the crushing guilt she'd been carrying. She started painting again, something she'd loved before but had abandoned during our nightmare. Her sessions with Dr. Yates became less frequent as she learned to forgive herself. She even started dating someone local, a kind guy named Kevin who worked at the hardware store. Watching her smile genuinely for the first time in months made me realize how much we'd all lost, and how far we still had to go to truly heal. 2 years after Lawrence's death, Ramsey gave us permission to reclaim our real identities if we wanted to. The organization had collapsed completely, and the remaining members were either in prison or had moved on to other criminal enterprises. We were no longer considered high-priority targets. Mom and Dad decided to keep living as Gordon and Susan Thornhill. They said they'd been David and Ellen Pritchard for such a short part of their lives compared to how long they'd been in protection. The Thornhill identity felt more real to them now. Ivy chose to go back to being Ivy Pritchard, her real name, because she needed that connection to who she'd been before everything fell apart. I decided to stay as Alex Mercer because I'd never really known who the baby version of me had been before witness protection. Alex Mercer was the only identity that felt authentic to me. We still live in that small rural town, and we still follow the midnight phone rule out of habit, even though the reason for it no longer exists. Some fears are just too deeply ingrained to simply disappear when the threat does. We've built a quiet life here that feels almost normal. Mom runs the library now. Dad manages the feed store. Ivy teaches art at the local community center and married Kevin last fall. I graduated college online and work as a remote software developer. We have friends, routines, and a sense of stability we never had before. But there's a permanent weariness in all of us, a hyper-awareness of our surroundings that will probably never fully fade. We survived, but the experience fundamentally changed who we are. Every phone call after midnight still makes my heart race, even though I know rationally that the danger has passed. Some rules transcend their original purpose and become part of who you are. And for the Thornhill family, the midnight phone rule will always be sacred.